Here we have a Sthil 036. Stick around to see a couple tips and tricks on splitting the case and what's required. So this will not be a how-to video. It'll be more of a highlights with a slightly more than basic tool collection involving some 2-jaw pullers and maybe a little MIG welder and a handy hydraulic press. You can make this job a little easier. Flywheel removal on this here Sthil chainsaw. There's threads inside of this, alright, and I went through stuff laying around, electrical conduit, compression type, fitting, the steel, stamped steel version. You have cast ones that won't work. If you get a stamped steel version, you can weld on it, and the thread on one end is very close to the thread in the flywheel, and you can weld a nut in one end, and you can thread a bolt in that nut you use, and you got a washer jammed on the end of it to spread the load, and that's going to push on the end of the crankshaft. So what you do is you back this all the way out, screw the fitting into the flywheel as far as you can, and crank the bolt, and the bolt pushes on the end of the crank. Now if it's a crankshaft you want to save, you got to be careful. You want to mushroom the end of the crank. So this is the factory nut that came off that holds and retains the flywheel on. I switched to a conventional nut. It's a metric thread, and I screwed that on there to protect the end of the crankshaft while using this homemade tool here. You torque that thing up in place, and then if you have to, you just a little strike with the hammer on the end of that, and then in this case the flywheel came right off just by tightening the bolt. Splitting the case in half. This is a tool, a piece of steel. It's about 3/8 thick, maybe a little thicker, and you use the 2 bar studs, drill holes to match, and then center up a hole over here, over the end of the crank. Drill that large enough to be able to clear the threads for a standard 2-jaw puller. The 2-jaw puller will grab each side of the flat bar, and the threads will push on the end of the crank, drawing the case half off of the crank. One caveat: there's a dowel pin in the front and a dowel pin in the rear. Okay, those stick, so careful cranking down the puller here. You have to watch the front of the case, you have to watch the back of the case, and you have to apply heat in the dowel pin areas, and have a dead blow hammer to start relaxing the case on each end while you're pulling in the center. You will see the center open up first. Just be careful, take your time. The heat in the aluminum case will expand and allow the dowel pin to slide out a little easier. But the dead blow hammer, good plastic, will aid in this process. After the case is split, you're going to get the crankshaft out of the other case half, and we just have a hydraulic press, a couple pieces of wood to protect the gasket surface, and on this side there's a dowel pin still in the case half, so we had to drill a hole in the piece of wood to receive that. And then just make sure the crankshaft is not going to press into anything such as wood pieces and what have you, and press away. So with the crankshaft removed, the bearing stayed in the case half. So what we did was, in a similar manner, we just, with the wood underneath, we used a socket smaller than the ID of this hole, so we don't want to damage that, but big enough to sit on the center hub of this bearing. Okay, and we just slowly press this right out. This bearing popped right out. Piece of cake. Same thing goes for this side. And again, you have to preserve the gasket surface. Alright, so use a good hardwood. Just watch your distance. You might have to use two pieces so that the bearing can actually slide all the way out. This one required a larger socket. Just be careful that it's smaller than the hole diameter so you don't gouge this, and take your time. Case is cleaned, ready to go. Now this side, the flywheel side, the bearing goes in against a stop. This is the first side. I am going to put together, crank into this side. That sets the distance of the crank on one side in my mind. And then with that together, I'll draw the two cases together, which will be driving this case onto the crankshaft, the other side of it. Okay, so the crank is drawn in successfully. I'll show you what I did. Nut, a couple washers, a socket. I made a tool here that screws on the ends of the crankshaft. We're working on the flywheel side again here. So this is the tapered end of the crankshaft. That's an M8 metric fine thread. You find yourself a nut that screws on there, and you weld it to a bolt, and then you use a socket and just draw it right out by hand, nice and easy, with a ratchet over the head of the ratchet. It did not take much effort, and one hand will hold the counterweight of the crankshaft on the back side to keep it from spinning, and just draw it in. Now you do have to be careful with what socket you use. You have to make sure you select your bolt length and your weld your socket accordingly. The depth of this was interfering in the last little bit of getting this crank all the way in. So all I had to do was put a washer under the socket, put the socket and nut back on, and just take a new bite. But if I were to do another one, longer bolt, deep socket, and that's a trick for this side. Don't forget your gasket. With the bearing already installed in the clutch side of the case, you can then draw the assembly onto the crankshaft. Couple washers, a lot of grease on the threads here. The tool initially wanted to back off the reverse threads of the crankshaft, but she started to go. It may be necessary to adjust the length of the socket to accommodate the thread length and clearance. Also handy is a dead blow hammer, plastic hammer, just to strike the areas where the dowel pins reside, and it does relieve some case tension as you're tightening the nut. So this is the tool that I made up to be able to draw the crankshaft into the clutch side of the case and assemble the two case halves together at the same time. So this is a reverse or a left-hand thread nut. Where I got my hands on that was the center from a clutch pack, and this just so happened to had to be replaced in this saw, so we used that, cut the 3 nubs off the nut, welded a piece of tubing and a bolt on there, and that would then screw on the end of the crankshaft, and then you use the sockets to draw it all together. So you have to be careful installing the seal. The crankshaft has a step on it in which the seal rides on, but in order to get this lipped seal over that step, you do not want to fold that seal surface. So you have to guide it on there in a way that it's not going to fold the seal going on, and a very thin, very flexible piece of plastic can be a tool you can use to accommodate that task. In the oil pump, new line, it's handy to have the thing clamped in place, a vise, nice leather glove, and a heat gun. And after cutting the tube to length, heat the area, not too hot, be careful, and then a carefully selected nail that fits inside that brass ferrule that sits at the bottom of the flare, and just take a cut-off wheel, cut the end of that off, and after the tube is heated, just tap that brass ferrule in there, nestle it in there nice. I went one step further and put a little RTV silicone sealant around that tube just to try and keep some of the oil from leaking back into this cavity. So after all that, the bar and chain put back on, and this baby's ready to go. I do hope that some of these homemade tools spark an idea that help you in your project. And of course, you can always go online and buy the tools you need to do the job. Hope you enjoyed the video. Till next time, have a good day.